Welcome to Genetic Alliance's webinar series. My name is Liz Horn. I'm the Director of the Genetic Alliance Registry and BioBank, and I will be moderating our webinar today. Today's topic is Demystifying the IRB, and we have two fantastic panelists with us today. We have Susan Brown Trinidad from the University of Washington and Marianna Bledsoe from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to go over just a few housekeeping rules. Our session today will be recorded, and this will be an archived webinar. It should be available sometime mid-next week. All of our participants are muted. You're in listen-only mode, so that means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. We have two presentations followed by a question and answer period. For the question and answer period, you will need to type your questions in the control panel that is on your screen. So please start sending those questions in as soon as you have them. We plan to have at least 15 minutes at the end to answer them. But again, you have to type them so we know what your questions are. And we'll be reminding you throughout the broadcast to send your questions. And finally, at the end, you will have an opportunity to take a survey about this presentation today. Please take the survey. It helps us evaluate our programs and helps us improve. So I would like to introduce Susan Brown Trinidad. She is a research scientist at the University of Washington. Her research focuses on ethical, legal, and social implications of genomic research, and she is a member of the University of Washington IRB.
So just to get started, and as Liz mentioned, I'm here at the University of Washington in Seattle. This is something that we just did a presentation on recently at a meeting of Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research. So I think for most of you who are here on the call, you have probably some ideas about who the IRB is. They are the people that beat you over the head. They are the star chamber that makes decisions we don't understand all the time. They want us to follow the rules. They scold us when we don't. And in general, they make life difficult. How IRBs see themselves, a little bit of background about who sits on an IRB. Sometimes we forget that the people who actually are doing this, unless it's a for-profit IRB, are typically volunteers. And they think of themselves as keeping participants in research safe, keeping the institution safe, and making sure that all of the applicable regulations are fulfilled and managed appropriately at the institutional level. So how IRBs see themselves is something more like this. And as Liz mentioned, I sit on an IRB myself. So just to get that part out of the way, a brief history of why we have IRBs. I'll talk about two different historical events that have been very, very important in shaping the way that we think about what IRBs do and why we need them. The first is following the Second World War. I'm sure that many of you have heard of some of the medical experiments that happened in Germany. There were similar kinds of things that happened in Japan as well. But truly, truly horrific human experimentation on prisoners of war, on concentration camp victims, things that are simply harrowing to think about. That went to a trial. There was a war crimes trial. 16 convictions from that, and 7 executions followed that. So that took care of the immediate problem of what to do with the people who had been found responsible for these bad acts. But it brought up questions about how we should think about governing research and what research ethics requires for studies that involve human participants. So we have the Nuremberg Code, which I won't read you all of these points, but the really, really key point is that consent has to be voluntary and informed. We can't just do things to people. That's what's called legally battery. You can't just do things to people's bodies. You can't ask them to do things without having them understand what it is that they're being signed up for. Research has to have a social purpose that you can't obtain in any other way. If you're going to use people as resources, essentially, which is what we do in research, we need to have a very strong ethical rationale for that. We need to make sure that studies are well designed. So that actually has, the issue of study design does have ethical content. If you've designed a half-baked study, it's not okay to sign people up and put them either at risk or even ask them to do anything that may be burdensome if the design isn't able to yield the scientific results that you need to have at the end. You need to be able to minimize harms, and a study that you know ahead of time may result in death or disability is not okay to do without, well, actually, for the kinds of things that we'll be talking about for the most part, death and disability as a foreseeable risk, completely unacceptable. And in any case, the benefits that are hoped to result from any kind of research have to outweigh the risks you're asking people to take. Investigators need to be qualified. Again, that is very similar to this point about scientifically valid design. If you don't know what you're doing, you can't ask people to volunteer for your study. There's always a right to withdraw from a study, and a stop rule is typically used in, invoked anyway, in clinical studies where you learn that, say, the drug that you're trying out is not working as you thought that it would. Or sometimes the stop rule will work the other way, that if you find that something is very effective and you're doing a trial where some people are getting placebo, you would stop and give everybody the study drug. The second historical event that is very relevant for the roots of research ethics is, of course, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. These went on for 40 years in the South. It was a U.S. Public Health Service funded project. And the basic history of this is they were interested in understanding what syphilis does, how syphilis works clinically in the bodies of black men. About 400 poor black men were enrolled in this. They had no idea they were in a research study. They believed they were getting medical care. And for many of them, this was the only way to see a healthcare provider at all. Treatment was not available in 1931 when this study first began, but penicillin became available later, and that was withheld from these men. The numbers vary widely on how many died during their participation in this study. And it hit the news in 1974 and caused a huge scandal, which brought up in the United States the opportunity to revisit this whole business of research ethics. So kind of the take-home from this historical event was realizing, you don't have to be a Nazi to make bad ethical errors in terms of what you're doing with human volunteers or non-volunteers in this case in health research. So what came out of that was what we refer to as the Belmont Report. In 1978, the government convened a panel to develop some guidelines that would oversee the way that research is involving humans is done in the United States. And it has 4 main principles, which are still the bedrock of research ethics for work involving humans. Respect for persons, which means that people who are competent adults and able to decide for themselves, that their decisions need to be respected, and that people who are unable to decide, so for example children or people with cognitive impairments, need extra protections, that researchers should be beneficent, meaning that they should help when they can, that selection of people who are in studies and the way that benefits are distributed needs to be just and fair, and non-maleficence, that we should not harm people who participate in research. So the way that IRBs think about research, when we get a study and we look at whether or not we should approve it, whether it should be allowed to move forward as proposed by the researchers, this is real quickly a list of the things that we think about. The first one is whether the risks are in line with what the hoped for benefits are of the study, whether the researchers have done a good job of minimizing risks that may come to people, and that can follow all the way through from how they approach people for recruitment, all the way through to how they protect information that's been collected, and what the procedures are in case something does go off the rails. Privacy protection is always important, and the safety monitoring plan, again, more common for clinical studies where there's an intervention happening, is an important part of what the IRB is looking for. The informed consent process is probably the thing that most people are most familiar with in terms of what the IRB is after, and this is making sure that people understand what they are agreeing to and understand their rights and responsibilities while they are enrolled in the study. Again, just as I mentioned at the end of that last slide about justice, participants need to be chosen fairly. So we can't cherry pick people that we think will be adherent to a proposed treatment regime because that will skew the results of the study, and it's also an issue of equity in terms of who has access to research participation. Safeguards for people who are vulnerable or who are at risk. Conflict of interest, usually that is financial conflict of interest, needs to be disclosed to participants and to the IRB ahead of time. And then there is a whole range of other compliance requirements that apply to different kinds of studies. So there's a regulatory function there as well. So one question that often comes up for people is when a project needs review. And so this is just a quick little cheat sheet that you can use to try to figure out whether you need to go to the IRB, because you don't always have to go to the IRB. The first question is whether your project meets the federal definition of research, which I've posted here. It needs to be a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So if you are doing a project that is for your own organization's internal information, that would be usually qualify as a quality improvement project or a program evaluation activity, and it may not require IRB review. You also need to be involving human participants. If you don't have people, you don't have to go to the IRB. Sometimes, if you do have people, but you don't know who they are, so that would be that you're using anonymous data, or you only have coded information, so you don't know who they are, but someone else may. You may qualify under current federal guidance for not requiring ongoing IRB review, and we can talk more about that if folks have questions. Another big point currently, and Marianna will talk about this a little bit later, under the current regulations, if the project is supported in any way by federal funds, IRB review is required if you have human participants and it qualifies as research. Right now, many institutions do require full IRB review for other kinds of projects, so projects that are supported by outside or commercial sponsors, but that is at the institution's discretion currently. And finally, if you will be submitting any data to the database of genotypes and phenotypes or other centralized repositories that are designed as ongoing research repositories, those may not require IRB review specifically, but an IRB does need to certify that all of the consents are in line for that kind of data sharing to be allowed. So we'll just run through a couple of examples here real quickly. When do you need IRB review? So if you're gathering contact information to mail out your own newsletter, that's not generalizable, and it's not designed to contribute to the general fund of scientific knowledge. So that doesn't have to go to the IRB. If you're doing an internal survey of your members, depending on what it's for, you may need IRB approval. If you are, for example, interested in what people think would be important research directions, that would not be something that would typically require IRB review if it's going to be used for your own internal information. If you're doing a survey that you plan to use in research to contribute to generalizable knowledge, that may require IRB review. If your survey is anonymous, you will get a lower level of review, or you may even qualify for exempt status. If you're establishing an online clearinghouse of resources about a particular condition, that's not research. You may do research to get those things pulled together, but it doesn't count as human subjects research. So you don't need to go to the IRB for that. If you're gathering blood samples or cheek swabs at a family reunion or a conference, presumably the only reason any of us would ever do that is for research use, and that will need to go to IRB review. And if you're collecting contact information and medical information to establish a registry, again, if that's a registry that will be used for research purposes, not just to mail out a newsletter or send email blasts about activities that you have that are ongoing, then yes, you would need to send that by the IRB. So just quickly, a couple of tips for working with the IRB, and these are really pretty commonsensical, so I imagine that these will make a lot of sense to most people. Behaving like a colleague and learning the ropes. How does this work? What do they need to know? And what is their job, right? What are they on the hook for making sure happens and doesn't happen? And trying to anticipate those things will make you a favored collaborator in the IRB's view, and that's a good place to be. Consult early and often. If you don't know the answer, if you're curious about whether you can, I'm making air quotes here, get something by, just call. Call and find out. And that actually links to the next point about respecting the IRB's time. If you're not sure what to do, rather than writing up a full application that you don't ever feel certain about, go ahead and call and find out what form is it supposed to be. Do you really need to do this? And generally, they'll be willing to answer those questions rather than, and they'll be happier doing that than reading a 50-page application that you didn't need to submit in the first place. Once something is down on paper, the IRB typically needs to respond to it on paper. So use the phone. That's an important real-life tip. It may be worth attending a meeting in person, getting to know people in the IRB world the same as anywhere else. Personal relationships help move things along. Cultivating friends, same thing. Please and thank you, same thing. It's easier to maintain that relationship and assume the best of each other when we know who the players are. So the don'ts are kind of the flip side of the things I've just mentioned. Assuming the worst generally gets you the worst as far, not only with the IRB, but in general. So again, rather than jumping to the conclusion that things are not going to work and they're out to get you, call. Immediate results are, I know, something that I'm also a researcher. We would all like to see these things move much more quickly. It's hard. I don't know of any IRB in the country that is not really overworked and trying hard to keep up with just a mountain of applications. And so being as patient as you can, and again, not writing applications that may not in fact be required is important. Don't cut and paste grant text into an application. Keep in mind that an IRB, first of all, is made up of volunteers, and second, most IRBs, while they do include scientists, may not include a scientist from your particular area. So, for example, I sit on the IRB I sit on, we have a number of physicians. We don't have a geneticist. We don't have currently a primary care physician. So assuming that because there are scientists they will know your area is a bad assumption. Don't try to guess what they want to hear. Again, ask, ask, ask. And anything you do that the IRB could interpret as trying to put one over on them will in fact mark you. And you want to have a good ongoing relationship with the IRB. Think of this in terms of working together over the long haul, and I think that will help a lot. So I've got a few resources here that you may find useful. The OHRP, the Office of Human Research Protection's website, has volumes and volumes of information. You may also be interested in Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, or PRIMER. That is the IRB professionals organization, and they have published a number of white papers on topics including biobanking that may be of interest to people on this call. For more general information about research ethics and human subjects protections, you can check out these two websites. The first one is here at the University of Washington. The next one is NIEHS, and that's a nice overview. And for people who are readers, I can recommend very highly this book by Rebecca Skloot called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And if you would like to contact me for any reason after this presentation, please feel free to do that. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Sue. That was a really great presentation. We will be hearing next from Marianna Bledsoe, but first I wanted to remind people that you are in listen-only mode, and I know you will have questions for Sue and Marianna. So please type them into your question boxes, start sending them now, and we will have about the last 15 minutes of the presentation as a question and answer discussion. So next I'd like to introduce Marianna Bledsoe. She is the Senior Program Manager for Biorepositories and Biobanking at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Her responsibilities include working on the strategic direction and oversight of the VA's tissue banking activities, and she's previously been with the NIH and the NCI. She is a member and a past president of ISBR, which is the International Society of Biological and Environmental Repositories. And she is going to talk to us today about preparing a protocol for the Institutional Review Board with a focus on biorepositories. Marianna? Marianna, did you unmute your line?
I'm sorry, and I did not. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Sue's just provided you with a very nice overview of the background history and the principles underpinning the ethical conduct of human subjects research, how to determine when you're conducting human subjects research that requires an IRB review, and some helpful hints in working effectively with an IRB. What Liz has asked me to talk to you today about is how to prepare a protocol for IRB review with a focus on repository protocols. This is a presentation that I gave at the 2011 meeting of International Society for Biological and Environmental Repositories. One very important part of getting your project through the IRB is having the right information in your protocol. Sometimes investigators have to go back and forth with their IRB because the IRB really didn't understand what they were trying to do, often because the protocol didn't have the right information in it. And so the protocol must contain enough information to determine whether or not the requirements of the regulations have been met, whether the repository's operating procedures and policies are adequate to protect participants, and that the repository is established and operated in an ethical manner. Effectively documenting the procedures and policies should help facilitate IRB review of the repository and reduce some of the frustration repository staff and IRB members may otherwise experience. It should also help things go much more smoothly with your IRB. In my talk today, I'm going to provide what I hope will be some helpful points to consider in preparing your repository protocol for IRB review. And this is just a quick disclaimer. Although federal regulations and policies are cited in this presentation, this presentation does not represent official policy guidance of the U.S. government. In the U.S., IRB review is required, as you heard from Sue, when the repository is conducting non-exempt human subjects research. That is, when there is interaction or intervention with a living individual or private identifiable information being recorded. Repositories can be structured in a variety of different ways, but there are generally three components. That is, there's the collection, the storage, and the research use. An IRB review and approval and oversight may be required for all three phases of research involving repositories. Many different models exist for repositories, and some repositories serve as the central storage and distribution facilities for specimens collected specifically for an individual research project or clinical trial. And these repositories may have a single collecting site or several collecting sites. So because multiple components may be involved, often at different sites, it's quite common that more than one IRB may be involved, depending on the structure and organization of the repository. In some situations, one IRB is responsible for all three phases of the research, and in others, one IRB may review, approve, and oversee the protocol for collection of specimens and data, whereas another IRB or two other IRBs review, approve, and oversee the repository itself and the specimen or data use protocol, respectively. Regardless of the structure and the organization of the repository, the protocol needs to have enough information and the right information for the IRB to satisfy their obligations under applicable regulatory requirements. And these may include the common rule, when the research is funded by one of 17 agencies that have adopted the common rule, the HIPAA privacy rule, when the repository is at a covered entity and a waiver of authorization is requested, or the FDA human subjects regulations apply regarding the conduct of clinical studies. In addition, there may be state and local laws and other institutional requirements that may apply. The amount of information and level of detail required for IRB review of a protocol may vary depending on the size of the repository, the nature of the repository, and the identifiability of the participants from whom specimens are collected. In cases where specimens are collected for a specific research project, but also intended to be shared with the central repository for sharing with other secondary researchers, for example, it may be desirable and sometimes necessary to develop a separate protocol for the repository operation generally. So repository managers may wish to discuss the issue of protocol organization with their IRB. From Sue, you learned about the ethical principles involved with the conduct of research. And basically, the IRB will be looking to see whether or not these principles have been fulfilled. They will be looking at the benefits and as to the individual, and usually in repository research, there is no direct benefit, but they'll also be looking at societal benefits. They'll be looking at the risks, the physical, psychosocial, privacy and confidentiality risks, and the mechanisms in place to protect against those risks, like policies and procedures for privacy and confidentiality. They'll also be looking at the principle of respect for persons, most embodied in the informed consent process and form, as well as justice, determining whether the distribution of benefits and risks is equitable and inclusion and exclusion of participants is fair. So what kinds of information need to be included in a repository protocol for IRB so that the IRB can assess regulatory compliance and ensure the ethical conduct of research? Although the exact information that you'll need to include will depend on the research context and national, local, and institutional requirements, there are a number of points to consider regarding content, and I'll present that on the following slides. These points to consider are not intended, however, to be a checklist or exhaustive list of everything that you have to include. So you'll want to check with your IRB and other institutional officials about their requirements. In any repository protocol for IRB review, it will be essential to describe the name, purpose, and overall goals of the repository, as it is important for the IRB to be able to assess the nature of the repository and the scientific purposes for which it is intended to be used. Although it is often not possible to describe all future uses in detail, the protocol should describe the research that will be conducted with the specimens and data in as much detail as possible so that the risks of the research, to the extent that it can be anticipated, can be considered. It will also be important to describe the administration and oversight of the repository, and in particular oversight mechanisms that are in place, such as scientific advisory boards, ethical oversight boards, and steering committees. The protocol should generally include any procedures for specimen and data collection. This should include details about the participants or donor population. For example, what populations are specimens obtained from? Do the participants have rare diseases or characteristics as individuals or groups that would facilitate identification? Are the participants from special or vulnerable populations? Are specimens from a particular ethnic, racial, or social group? Are the participants from a population that may have unique views about biological specimens, for example, certain Native American groups? And are the participant populations from particular geographic regions? You'll also want to include information about how participants, previously existing specimens, or study populations are identified. For the establishment of repositories involving previously collected specimens, how will the specimens and data for inclusion in the repository be identified and selected? If one or more subsets of specimens will be omitted from the repository, what is the rationale, and what are the scientific, for example, statistical power, and ethical, for example, justice and participant selection implications for future use? Other information to include is information on what specimens and data will be collected. Where are the sites at which specimens will be collected? What are the procedures for data collection? Who will collect it? Will the specimens be obtained from collections that were established for other purposes, for example, residual diagnostic specimens or specimens collected for other research purposes? For specimens collected during the course of care, which is quite common, what procedures are in place to ensure that patient care will not be compromised as a result of specimen banking and distribution? In order to assess risk to privacy and confidentiality, the IRB will also need information on the data that will be collected with the specimen. For example, what personal identifying information will be collected, what other participant data will be collected, will data be collected from family members, and so on. The protocol should also describe whether or not there are ongoing interactions with participants. Will specimens be collected once, or will multiple specimens and or data from the same participant be collected over time? Will individual participant data be updated? These are all important considerations to include in your protocol. The protocol should contain a description of recruitment and informed consent procedures. For the prospective collection of specimens and data, how will the individuals from whom the specimens will be obtained be recruited and selected? You'll want to include information about that. What recruitment materials and advertisements will be used? The IRB will want to see those as well. Will consent be obtained, and if so, from whom will consent be sought? What is the process for obtaining consent? And what other educational tools will be used, if any? If you're going to request a waiver, you'll want to include enough information for the IRB to assess whether or not the waiver criteria have been met, and so you'll need a justification. If you're using subjects that may be unable to consent themselves, for example, children or those who are cognitively impaired, you'll want to describe the procedures to obtain consent or permission from those individuals. You'll also want to address, if you're using children in your research, what will happen when the child reaches the age of consent, and whether or not there's a plan to request a waiver at that point from the IRB. You'll also want to be very specific about what the provisions are for participants to withdraw their consent and what that means, and what will happen to the specimens and data when individuals withdraw their consent. The protocol should also include a description of the methods used for protection of subject autonomy, privacy, and confidentiality, since these are often the greatest risks of repository research. For example, are specimens and associated data linked in any way to subject identity? Who has access to identifying information about the subjects? Who has access to the key code linking the specimens and or data to subject identities? What policies or other mechanisms are in place to protect confidentiality? Are there employee confidentiality agreements, encryption techniques that are being used, certificates of confidentiality, honest broker mechanisms, or agreements for prohibiting re-identification of specimens of data by recipients? What is the repository's policy about releasing personal identifying personal and individual identifiers? For example, Social Security numbers, name, date of birth, etc., to repository users. Under what circumstances, if any, will identifiers be provided with the specimens and data? And what mechanisms are in place to assure future uses of subject specimens and data are consistent with the informed consent. This is a very important stewardship responsibility of repositories. And then, if applicable, how will the repository apply with the requirements of health information privacy laws, such as the HIPAA privacy rule, or other relevant regulations, such as the FDA regs? The protocol should also include information on specimen and data storage and retention. For example, where will the repository be located? How will specimens be stored by the repository, be identified or coded? Will they be assigned a unique number by the repository? How will the specimens and data be secured? What are the procedures for secure storage of specimens and data? Those should be described in your protocol. And how long will the specimens and data be stored? And what will happen to the specimens and data after the retention period has lapsed? If you're going to be deriving cell lines or DNA, that also should be described in the protocol. In order to ensure that specimens and data will be handled appropriately for specific research projects by secondary users, the procedures and policies for specimen and data distribution should also be described. Information about the types of specimens that will be distributed and associated data, what data will be provided to researchers with the specimen is important to include. With whom will the specimens and data be shared, and what are the conditions for sharing? The processes in place for assuring appropriate access should also be described. How will the repository prioritize requests for specimens? What are the policies regarding secondary distribution of specimens? For example, is there a policy that forbids investigators from transferring specimens to third parties, except as required by law? And what is the repository's policy regarding commercial use? This is very important. You'll also want to describe policies on users' fees. Are there any users' fees, and what do they cover? Are they shipping and handling, or are they basically for cost recovery of the cost of procuring and maintaining the specimens? And then what kinds of agreements will recipient investigators and their institutions be asked to sign before specimens and associated data are distributed? For example, material transfer agreements or data use agreements. There are a number of other different kinds of information that may need to be provided. These include information on what is perhaps one of the hottest ethical issues related to repository operation right now, and that is the return of research results. What is the repository's policy, if any, concerning when, if individual research results should be returned to subjects, and how will this be done? For example, what is the repository's policy, if any, concerning the return of sensitive or incidental findings, which in some cases may include misattributed paternity, clinically significant biomarkers, etc. If the repository plans to return individual research results, how will this be done? What is the repository's policy about returning aggregate generalized findings to subjects? If the repositories plan to return aggregate generalized research findings, how will this be done? There's a number of other issues that need to be considered, and these are issues that relate to appropriate stewardship and intellectual property issues related to the repository. It should be, the plans should be described for what happens if the PI or repository manager leaves the institution or the repository loses funding. It's also important to include what the policies will be on rights to intellectual property from research resulting from future research. And then it's also important to address if there are unique cultural perspectives or views about use and disposition of specimens, how those will be addressed. So you see there's a lot of important information that you may want to include in your repository protocol for IRB review. And so what are the important take-home messages here? I think some of these you've already heard from Sue about. Check with your IRB in advance to determine what their requirements are for preparing a protocol for IRB review. Make sure you stay abreast of relevant requirements, both at the national level and locally. And as I'll discuss in the next several slides, the regulations will be changing in ways that may affect repositories. So you'll need to follow these developments very closely. Again, make sure to provide enough information to for your IRB so that they can determine whether relevant requirements are met, and that the repository will be established and operated in an ethical manner. As Sue said, don't assume that they will know what you are doing or what you need. Be clear and explicit in the information you provide. And finally, as Sue also mentioned, engage your IRB early and often during the preparation of your protocol. Establishing a good rapport and close dialogue with the IRB will help educate them on what you are trying to do and help facilitate the review and oversight. So now I'm going to switch gears a bit. Liz asked me to talk briefly about some of the regulatory and policy developments related to repositories. Before I do that, I wanted to provide a brief overview of the federal rulemaking process, because some of you may not be aware of what it is. The rulemaking process is characterized by the development of proposed rules, followed by an open public comment period before the rules are finalized and published. Sometimes these rules start out with what's called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, or ANPRM, that indicates an agency's intent to change the rules and seeks input and feedback in certain areas. These ANPRMs are published in the Federal Register and open for comment for a specified period of time, like 60 or 90 days. Then the agencies review the comments and then develop a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM. And the NPRM is again issued for public comment in the Federal Register for a specified period of time. Comments are received and then analyzed by the agency before the rule is finalized and published in the Federal Register as a final rule. As I mentioned earlier, a number of regulations and policies related to repository research are currently under review. And you may be aware that there have been proposed changes to the HHS Human Subjects Regulations in a proposed advance notice of proposed rulemaking, enhancing protection for research subjects and reducing burden, delay, and ambiguity for investigators. The ANPRM requested comments on how current regulations for protecting human subjects who participate in research might be modernized and revised to be more effective while facilitating valuable research with the goal of reducing burden, delay, and ambiguity for researchers. I'm not going to go through the rule in detail because it is complex, and because it is only an ANPRM, the proposal could change before the rule is finalized. However, I do want to mention that there are a number of proposed changes that may affect repository research. These include mandatory data protection standards for all research, a new definition of identifiability, proposals for new consent requirements for specimen research, including broad consent for future use of de-identified specimens. For a summary of the proposed changes, I would direct you to the OHRP web link shown in my slide. The ANPRM was issued on July 26th, and the comment period closed October 26th of 2011. And during that period, there were 1,119 comments submitted. As I indicated in the previous slide, the next step is generally issuance of a notice of proposed rulemaking, which again will solicit comments for a specified period of time before any changes are finalized. So you'll need to stay tuned. In addition to the HHS human subjects regulations, there have also been proposed changes to the HIPAA privacy rules, and these may also affect repositories. Some of the proposed changes include the removal of the prohibition from combining a HIPAA authorization for a clinical trial with the HIPAA authorization for specimen banking, a proposal to allow HIPAA authorizations for future unspecified research, new restrictions on the sale of protected health information, and a request for comments for the removal of the accounting requirements for research. And then a new requirement to provide reports to individuals on who has access to their protected health information. These rules are being finalized for issuance as final rules. I'm not quite sure when they'll come out, but it's probably several months away. For more information, you can, on both of these proposed regulations, you can go to regulations.gov, and for the rules for the changes to the privacy rule, you can go to the Office for Civil Rights Privacy website for more information. These are just some of some useful websites and links where you can find more information about these regulations and policies. I wanted to draw your attention to the 2012 annual meeting, let me go back, of the International Society for Biological and Environmental Repositories, ISPR. ISPR is a professional society of organizations and individuals that create opportunities for sharing ideas internationally and harmonizing approaches to evolving challenges in biobanking and repository operation. ISPR fosters collaborations, creates education and training opportunities, and provides an international showcase for state-of-the-art research findings and cutting-edge technologies. The goal is to promote best practices that cut across the broad range of repositories that ISPR serves. ISPR has published its own set of best practices for repositories, and you can download them from the website. ISPR's annual meeting in 2012 will be held in Vancouver of May of next year, and the theme is keeping step in an evolving global research environment, biobanking for now and for the future. The sessions will focus on new partnerships and collaborations, new technologies, evolving ELSI issues, and sustainability and disaster planning. And I would encourage all of you to join us and consider attending the annual meeting in Vancouver. And lastly, this is my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at any time. And I'd like to thank Liz for inviting me to this webinar.
Thank you so much, Marianna. That was a wonderful presentation. It was very informative. And we've been getting a lot of great questions that have been coming in. So what I would like to do now is direct some of the questions to our presenters, Susan and Marianna. And so I think if you could both unmute your phones, that would probably be a good next step. So Sue, this one is for you. For someone who's not affiliated with a hospital or a university, how would they go about choosing an IRB to submit to? Is there an element of sponsorship by a hospital or university that's needed?
Typically not, and actually I think, and Liz, I'm going to invite you to jump right back in here, that Genetic Alliance has some advice on how to choose an IRB. There are for-profit, kind of for-hire IRBs out there. Depending, you may also be able to arrange some kind of agreement with a local university, depending on how you're funded, to have them stand in as the IRB of record for you.
Absolutely, and I think so Genetic Alliance has its own IRB, and there are a lot of other for-profit or non-profit IRBs, including Western IRB and some others. And I think the one thing that's just really important, if you're submitting to an IRB, it's very helpful that they have experience working on the kinds of studies that you will be submitting for. That would be my only suggestion. We do have some information on our website about where you can find other IRBs, and I'll be going over some of our resources at the end. Thank you. So this question is for Marianna. In the case of a research project funded by a federal organization that houses a university, does the researcher need to submit to their university IRB as well as the federal agency's IRB? How does that work?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what situation is being referred to here. Certainly, when you say the federal agency's IRB, I guess I would have to get clarification on that question.
So if you've asked that question, if you could just type a follow-up, we can go back to it. Here's a question for either one of you. Does the subject need to be informed about cell line generation and genomic studies during the informed consent project? I think the question is really, in the informed consent project, you need to tell them what will happen with their specimens.
Speaking for the University of Washington IRB that I sit on, we would absolutely require that that be disclosed and any questions about it answered. Another question or just another issue you may think about is whether you would allow a person to participate in a study and give separate, even if they didn't agree to that part. So if you had a study that was a genetic study and kind of as a sideline to that you wanted to create a cell line, whether you would allow people to opt out of the cell line piece and still be in the study. So those are just some of the kinds of issues you want to think through ahead of time. But yeah, we would require that that be disclosed and discussed.
Yeah, and I think as a general matter, it usually is as a best practice that those are two areas where you would want to be very specific. And as Sue said, you might also consider allowing them to opt out, depending on what the main goals of the study and whether they were integral to the main goals of the study.
Great, thank you. Here's another question for either of you. Regarding children's subjects, is asking for a waiver of reconsent when children come of age being compliant with informed consent process regulations?
Well, I can take that one. Yeah, I think that the guidance from OHRP indicates that the IRB needs to consider whether or not the subject needs to be reconsented when they turn the age of majority. But there is an allowance for a waiver of consent under those circumstances. So again, that would depend on the research context and whether or not the waiver criteria could be met.
Right, and the other piece to just think about in real practical terms is if you're talking about a study that was a single blood draw on infants, you've had no further subject contact since that time. That's a very different situation from one where you have ongoing contact with the person. It's actually, there's not a real big barrier to getting consent. Very often the IRB is willing to consider, provided that the ethical and regulatory piece is met, to consider the burden on the researcher. But you would have a harder time, I think, with most IRBs getting a waiver if it was really not very burdensome to ask people.
Yeah, and I think this issue of going back to people when it's been a long time since you had a one-time blood draw, you know, there are issues, ethical issues there in terms of, you know, just recontacting people after they might have gotten a diagnosis that was created a fair bit of anxiety, and recontacting them again at that point may actually be an ethical issue.
Great, thank you. And here's a question that's about advocacy organizations who are involved in research registries and biobanks. So the question says that many advocacy organizations have created patient registries that are unaffiliated with research institutions, and IRBs may not always be involved with the review and approval of these registries. Can you discuss the ethical issues involved with advocacy organizations who develop this type of data bank?
I think depending on what kinds of things you want to be able to do in the future, it may make sense to go ahead and have sort of a global level IRB approval for a registry. And it works sort of the same way as what Marianna was talking about when you get approval for a biorepository. So approving the sort of the place where data lives is one piece, and then another piece would be as research protocols come in, those would get separate review. But the piece about making sure that a registry or a biorepository has been approved would be that you've had someone look to say you have good protections in place for storing, whether it's data or samples or whatever it is you have good procedures in place for how you're going to gather those data, how you're going to send them out to whoever it is that's going to be doing research with that material. You have good procedures for consent up front for getting people into that system. I think there's real value in having there be some level of approval and review of the, I'm gesturing, but you can't see that, the place where you're keeping the stuff, whatever the stuff is, so that you have that approved, and then the research review comes through as a separate procedure.
Yeah, and that's very similar to how we do it at the Genetic Alliance Registry and Biobank, where our IRB protocol is for the collection and storage and distribution of samples. And then if there's an investigator who wants to use the samples, they go through their IRB for the use of those samples. So our IRB accepts their IRB's approval for the future or the downstream uses of those samples.
Yeah, that's a very common repository model and really a best practice to have the registry's operating procedures and policies reviewed by an IRB.
And I think if you're doing research within an advocacy organization, a lot of advocacy organizations do this. It's slightly non-traditional, and I think that it works very well when you have an IRB who is used to these kinds of infrastructure. So in talking within the community, we can learn which IRBs groups have gone to for approval. And a lot of people have had really good experiences. So I think I know that both Sue and Marianna said engage your IRB early and often. This would be a good question to ask them. So this question is for Marianna. How can we be informed when new rules come out, specifically around the ANPRM or an NPRM?
Well, I do know that both Genetic Alliance and ISPR have listservs, and I think they have been, I don't know that I can speak for Genetic Alliance, but Genetic Alliance is pretty good about putting news items or newsworthy items for their membership out on the listserv. So certainly that's one mechanism, but checking regulations.gov is a great way, and also checking the website, OHRP's website. OHRP also has a listserv. I would encourage you to go up to their website and sign up to be on their listserv. And OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, also has a listserv. So they disseminate information in that way. So there's a number of different ways that you can actually try to stay on top of that information.
Perfect. And in the last few moments, I would like to just let you know of some of the resources that we have at Genetic Alliance that we've designed around registries and biorepositories. We have a BioBank bulletin that comes out once a month that you can sign up for, that we discuss current issues. We have a weekly tip series. Our most recent one was about ensuring biobank samples, as well as a very robust archive for the past year. We have a number of resources that link to other important sources of information like ISBR, like OHRP, that provides information about human research protections. And we've built an entire toolbox of starting at the beginning of what is a biobank to how do you build a biobank, what do you need to know, and how do you stay current. And then we've also begun to develop this to navigate the ecosystem of translational science. And with that, we have come to a close for our webinar. I would like to thank both of our panelists, Sue and Marianna, for really informative presentations. Our webinar will be archived and it will be available for viewing in about a week. We have a survey at the very end that we hope you will complete. And please let us know what other webinar topics you're interested in, especially around biorepositories and IRBs. And finally, I know we were not able to get to all of the questions, but we will be contacting you with some follow-up information. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me at lhorn@geneticalliance.org. And I want to thank everyone for participating today, and I wish you all a wonderful day.